This is a session on resilience. And this started with some conversations, primarily with Kate Wright, about how do we assess the resilience of a food system. And she came to us with this idea, and we wrote a grant proposal to take on this concept with USDA. We wrote the proposal, and Tommy was the lead author on this, and I'll introduce Tommy here in a second. But the idea of resilience really started to resonate with us. Can't hear me? Can you hear me in the back now? Okay, we'll all have to shout. We are going to break out into small sessions. So we're going to kind of introduce some ideas here. But I want to point out that the graduate students that you're going to be introduced to here and that participated, and undergraduates that participated in this process, as well as folks from Open and Local, the local group food system, did a lot of thinking about how do we assess resilience. And so what we started to think about is really, like good reductionist scientists, we broke it down into different scales of how we might assess resilience, because it was just easier for us to think about, I guess. It certainly gets way more complex as you move up the food chain, let's say from production up to actually the distribution and processing and distribution, etc. So what we're going to do is introduce kind of ways, the ways that we took to get to the ideas of resilience and how we might assess those. And what we're looking for is a lot of input, a lot of participation. So those of you that participate at different scales in the system will have way more knowledge about that aspect than us, and we want that input. But ultimately, I guess what we're trying to say is we think we have a way to do this, but we want that to be assessed and reviewed in this system. So, Tommy, can I turn it over to you? Tommy Bass is a PhD student. First of all, he's an extension specialist in the Animal and Range Department, and also a PhD student with me in the Land Resources and Environmental Science Department. Let me just start this conversation by saying that the first thing when we think about the concept of resilience is resilience to what, for what. And so that's sort of elemental in the way that we consider resilience and the way we're thinking about it. And we think of it in terms of, in order to simplify it, resilient to things like climate change and the kinds of things that really seem to threaten production systems at this point. And a lot of those are economic in nature. So in other words, the tariffs and things like that, and the changes in those that make it very difficult to predict. You might plant and then suddenly some trade agreement occurs, and that basically means that whatever you planted is not going to be worth much. Dave would know that well, that concept sitting in the food system. For what? Well, it's for maintaining a system, maintaining something that's will have well-being in its nature. So that's really where we're trying to head with this idea. So now that Tommy can start, I'll quit talking.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce, for going extemporaneous there. Anyway, once again, my name is Tommy Bass. I'm the Livestock Sustainability Associate Specialist for MSU Extension. But through my work with niche livestock producers and the meat processing industry in Montana, I've become a lot more curious and inspired to sort of study food systems as a whole, and then this concept of resilience. So these opening slides here really are to try and bring in some of the maybe academic curiosities that we have, and then figure out how that can be about working with producers and agri-food entrepreneurs in general to try and help design more resilient systems at different levels. So we tried to adapt some of these academic definitions of resilience here. And there's some key points. believe me, they were even more wordy before we sort of pulled them down. But the whole concept really is there's a system that has some observable function and processing and products, and it's going to be stressed, or it's going to have what we call a perturbation. And resilience is, due to that chronic stress or an intense acute perturbation, can it still maintain the function that we're observing and that we're expecting that system function, we're expecting it to maintain. So the concept of a farm, Bruce mentioned a variety of perturbations. It could be a market crash, a trade agreement, it could be severe weather, it could be chronic changes in climate due to climate change, obviously. Will that farm still be able to maintain its general functions and goals, or will it fail, or will it have to go under some sort of drastic reorganization, right? So anyway, the last definition here, adapted from Altieri, resilience is the ability of a farming system to absorb disturbances and adapt to stress and change while retaining its productivity. So a pretty good summary of the work all the way back to Holling in the 70s, who's an ecologist, and folks that have built upon his definition over years. We can also look at resilience at different scales. So my curiosity and my PhD research is up here, kind of the value chain area and then up to the whole food system. But a lot of my colleagues and fellow grad students in Bruce's lab are down here at field and farm level. And we're going to look at each of these briefly, but I just want to sort of show what we're talking about in this trend. So as far as data and information and even possible control or management of a system, it's much finer scale down here in the field. There's multiple environmental variables, but maybe a narrower range of social and economic variables when you're trying to just parse out or assess what defines resilience at the field level, right? Maybe for a crop, for a season, for a crop over a multi-year rotation. The farm, the complexity is increasing. Multiple fields, multiple crops. Each of these fields might behave a certain way based on history, soil, geology, and then more fields in the farm. You're also bringing in perhaps more social and economic variables, multiple family members, different enterprises. And then the value chain is a better way to describe a supply chain, particularly in agri-food systems. We're adding value up through each step from harvest, aggregation, processing, value added, different distribution channels. But the variables are increasing in those more or less tangible variables. So a greater number of less tangible variables, more economic, more social variables, and then all the way up to the food system, which is the most complex. So I kind of got ahead of myself. That means I can save a little time. So just the field scale, thinking about, it's more detail on how we might manage it. And as we move up the scale, we have increasing ranges of variables and more complexity. So maybe our answers or predictions about behavior or performance or resilience become less accurate. And then when we go to that, value chain, we're bringing in other enterprises. So resilience in the value chain doesn't just revolve around a field or a farm or a crop. It also involves all these other external partners to add value to this product, to bring this product to ultimately consumers. And then certainly with the whole food system, we're looking at the broadest set of variables, and probably the least opportunity right now we have to make predictions and provide advice. So we're trying to, at least my research is trying to close down some of those gaps to think about how advising producers, processors, agri-food entrepreneurs can be influenced by helping them understand their place in this whole system. So, other scholars have sort of inspired our work and what we'd like to try and do with you all today. And I've sort of highlighted the words to narrow down a big chunk of text on the slide, which is like a no-no in PowerPoint 101. But as we work with you today to try and pilot test some assessment ideas and adaptations we've made from other scholars. We want to think about this resilience concept, and that at first it's probably best understood from a broader context. And that the framework that we're going to play with a little bit today in a group is trying to think about relationships to different variables at multiple scales. We're going to have different groups from that field scale to farm scale, and then sort of a value chain food system interface group to make it a little more collaborative. And we are not going to be working with very quantitative variables today. There'll be some numbers in our methods, but we're taking that broad framework pass for the first time today. And just some of the tenets of what this process is we want to be able to do cooperatively here during this session. Work with the scales and then multiple boundaries, field, farm, value chain. Want to keep an open mind and be attentive to the diversity and flexibility and then the different relationships between variables, both within sort of the bounded smaller system and then as it interacts up that scale. And then just be open to adaptation of our methods. We've proposed some starter variables that Hannah will present in a moment, but it's up to everybody in this room to sort of change our assumptions on what variables are important in assessing resilience. From a paper that we've all been reading and discussing lately in our lab group, there's this excellent quote to sort of kick off the day. Like, what is the goal of resilience scholarship and then resilience outreach and extension? And really it's to try and figure out how to promote healthy livelihoods and landscapes amidst challenging social and ecological conditions. So really this is the founding, it's sort of our call to action to work with you all today in this interactive session. So what's it going to look like? We're going to try and stay on time, get back on time. Hannah's going to present sort of the primary methods of resilience assessment we want to play with and pilot with you all today. We're going to have some potential breakout groups, so we'll just see how the group as general shakes out. Paul's going to lead with a larger conventional farm example, looking at resilience from that standpoint. Sasha will lead a medium-sized farm. We have Laura and Braden looking at the market garden scale situation. Hannah, large-scale organic or conventional, just depending what you all decide as we shake out into groups. And then finally, I'd like to work with the group thinking about variables of resilience and how to assess that at sort of the value chain level, and then possibly even the food system where there's multiple value chains. And then finally, we'll conclude after a brief report back from our groups with a panel to discuss these issues. So our panel members listed here will be facilitated by Bruce and questions from you all. So with that, I need to pass this off to Hannah to sort of give us a quick primer and some instructions on the assessment methods we want to pilot.
Hi everyone, my name's Hannah, and I'm a PhD student in Bruce's agroecology lab. So two of our main inspirations for this method of assessing resilience are Miguel Algieri and John Quinn. So for those of you who came to last year's Aero Expo, Miguel actually gave the keynote address, and he talked about some of the work he does. A lot of it's with pretty small scale farmers in Latin America, but he's a huge inspiration for what we'll be doing today. And David Quinn is John Quinn, is someone we've just started collaborating with, and we'll talk about some of his stuff near the end if we have time. So the Algieri method that we are modifying today is in the form of a spider diagram, which are really simple, and they're important to understand today because in your groups, each of you will have the chance to assess your own farm if you have one, or help someone else fill out theirs. So essentially on this graph, you can see the green polygon in that diagram is of a diversified agroforestry system. And the red one, which you can see is smaller, is a traditional, just like banana cacao farm. So the main idea being the red polygon is less diverse and therefore less resilient, whereas the green is greater area has greater resiliency. So each of the axes are just a measure of resilience that he's chosen in the study. So the further out you are on the axis, the more resilient your system is. So we've modified this for thinking about what would that look like in Montana rather than Latin America. And this is where your job comes in to help us fill in some of these if we've forgotten something or change the ones that you don't like. But here on the right side, the black labels, those ones, the further out you go, the more resilient perhaps your field is. So this is at the field scale where you would think about just one field within your farm. For example, the soil conservation practices, we have a metric that we'll also hand out where we'll talk about, most of these are out of 10, for example, so you can follow along with this when you're in your small groups. But basically, you're going to try and quantify how many soil conservation practices you implement within a field. Same with the number of crops over the last 10 years, how much you incorporate livestock into the system, all of these different variables. And then the ones on the left side, the confusing part is we're looking at them as having a negative impact. For example, perhaps how many insect pest species you have. If you're having more pests, you're probably less resilient. So that's why that one is flipped. So you get to choose if you would rather look at the field scale. This is an example for if this is what your farm looks like. And this on the field in 2010, you can actually track it over time. So that's where this tool would be really useful. Is that perhaps in 2015, maybe you increased some of your soil conservation practices, or you spent more money on crop insurance, and you can see how it changes over time. Same thing at the farm scale. We've just changed a few of the variables, as well as the product value chain that Tommy will be talking about. These can change the food system as well, which we won't be doing a small group over. And lastly, this is what Laura's group will look like. And so I think, let's just break out into our small groups. So if maybe you guys can spread yourselves out, and then we'll go to groups, and we'll start putting this into practice.
It might work best, actually, if you identify a small group, take your poster with you, which we have posters of these. And what we've put for variables up there are just starters. And some of them might be inappropriate. Cross them out, add something new. Take a look at this and think about, well, no, wait, you're missing something. You know, there's all kinds of ways to edit this. Again, this was just a straw man to put in front of you to kind of go through and take apart and assess and give your own pieces to this. So really want to emphasize that. This is an opportunity to kind of get that feedback from you into these diagrams. And so it's a place to communicate more than being something official in terms of what could come of this. But the other point is that as you start to look at these polygons, I think you start to see places, or what's crucial about them is they start to demonstrate in a very nice visual way places where your system might be the weakest and where you need help or where you need work, where you might need a government program. Those are the kinds of things I think to be thinking about in terms of how this might aid you. So let's separate out. I don't think there's anything going on out in the big room, is there? Anybody been out there lately? You guys came in late. Okay, good. Well, so there's a place where we can put a poster down and you can kind of gather around and look at those in your small groups. So associate with these folks, and if there's some imbalance in numbers, we'll correct. We're gonna hear back then from the group, from the facilitator at each of the tables about what they learned, real quick sort of summary. And then from that, we'll talk about reviewing the concept in general from our expert panel. So Tommy, you wanna start with?
Okay, so when we were talking about product value chain and then eventually on up to the full food system, in my intro I talked about that was where the data would be more coarse or less finite. We're talking about the broadest sorts of interactions. But right here we're talking about a product value chain, and we decided to play around with most of our time brainstorming more variables that would be appropriate at this product value chain level. And then we decided to consider a single product value chain in north central northwestern Montana, so malting grains in an area that is largely contracted with Anheuser-Busch. And so with the variables we had brainstormed and the sample ones, we found that we were kind of maximizing some. The farmers felt like they were getting a fair price for that, and then all the way to the consumer end, I don't think people complain about cheap beer. But then we see some of these like points coming way in towards the center, or the more negative, like a market diversity. And this group of farmers, despite having historically felt adequately paid, the last 2 or 3 years had contracts cut by greater than 50%, right? So long-term contracts that were suddenly modified, and they had no say in that. So, you know, a sharp turn back in, a reduction in the possible area of some sort of resilient score. Same with trust and transparency and pricing and contracting. So, you know, another fallback. We could also think about maybe that metric in consumer trust in the product. Was it after last year's Super Bowl, all the fighting about rice grains and cheap beer instead of actual American cereal grains? So that trust and transparency would be reflected with a number of ways through the value chain. But at any rate, I think the point is we see that we might have maximized some variables that were considered positive, you know, in the supply chain by stakeholders, but then strong points bringing us way down here into this negative range and potentially reducing resilience and sustainability.
So, okay, our group worked on organic farm scale system for like a mid-size organic farm was what we were thinking. So we kind of got through a lot of the physical factors on the farm. We talked about crop species diversity, so having more diversity being better both within a year and over years. We thought one thing that was sort of missing from this maybe was a discussion on intercropping, so giving additional points if you are intercropping across within a field. We also got into talking about diversity of animal species, both pollinators and birds on your farm. We wondered if maybe not so much counting the species themselves, but counting area that was wildlife friendly. So one of our farmers talked about how they planted pollinator strips and buffer areas around their field to allow for wildlife. So we could possibly measure that in that way. And then just kind of other animals as well, mammals and so on. And then another thing a theme that kept coming up was this idea of resiliency through collaborating with your neighbors. And so one thing that we thought was missing was that collaboration and how you can both share labor and equipment, and that can increase your farm resilience quite a bit. So those are some of the things we discussed.
Great, thanks. Ray, what'd you take away?
Laura and I worked on sort of adding a couple more points on here. If you'd like to speak about any, I will at least talk to the electricity. We brought up the point that, or our group brought up the point that fuel sources might be changing to electricity soon. At some point, it might be a valuable variable for how self-productive you are of electricity if you have any self-producing methods, or if you're just entirely reliant on the grid.
Yeah, and I thought another really valuable thing that we had neglected to put on our original Spider plot was this idea of value-added enterprises. So for a smaller, more market garden farm, ways you're increasing your revenue that don't necessarily have to do with direct crop production, and also this idea of resiliency within your community. So what impact do you have in your community? How engaged are you with local community members, and how that can increase your overall resiliency. And we went through this kind of looking at resiliency in terms of also different crops to think about. Like I know labor cost was a really big thing for us for certain crops compared to others. So when you start looking at some of these other variables, how you maybe if you increase your labor costs, you can reduce, your other input costs. So how you can change this crop by crop also is really something we focused on.
Great. So we did a large conventional field as our little case study. We never actually got around to filling anything out. We just had a really good discussion about what these metrics are and how we can change them. So we sort of started off with some of these categories are a little too broad. Maybe they should be broken up into other things. So for example, soil conservation practices. We wanted to break up into ways to reduce wind or water erosion. But eventually we came back full circle of, well, maybe we should lump all those together and then also include soil organic matter in there. But then there was other categories that are a little too specific. So for example, number of pollinator species. If we're looking at a wheat farmer, for example, he doesn't really care how much, or he or she doesn't really care how much bees are around because they don't need to pollinate the wheat. So maybe this should be more beneficial organisms rather than specifically pollinators. Same with things like the landscape use diversity matrix. It doesn't really matter how diverse the landscape is around you. What matters more is how your neighbors are managing that land. And so, for example, like herbicide drift, for example, through an organic field but surrounded by conventional, even if they're all different crops around you, but they're all conventional, herbicide can still come in. And then we added a couple more, like water infiltration and soil acidity are metrics that we need to take into account. And then beyond just the number of weed species impacting the crop, herbicide-resistant weeds are perhaps more important than the number of weeds you actually have there. And then sort of the big thing that we took away is that all of these are subjective, and it's also subjective how you weight each of these, because each of these metrics shouldn't necessarily be equal. And then the interrelatedness of each metric of, if you change one, that'll shift your entire bubble and affect all the other metrics. Is something that definitely needs to be hammered out in the future.
We almost finished, we didn't quite get there, but one of our problematic variables, since we're working with an organic farm, is that the amount of input cost spent on fertilizer versus chemical fertilizer, that should be broken up. And also fertilizer being just manure, or is it also your green manure, which Bob brought up a great point. Those seeds can be expensive. So how much of that seed do you save yourself? How much of it are you buying? That should be incorporated into the variable. Another interesting one we thought of was the government program variable. Some government programs are kind of addressing an issue on the farm that's low resiliency, and it's trying to make up for that, whereas other ones might be rewarding a farm for something it does well. So that should be broken up as well. And one interesting one, we discussed how do we incorporate what we just heard in this keynote address, how do we create new opportunities for people to participate in farming that traditionally are excluded. So we didn't quite get to how we do that yet, but we want to add that.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're going to jump into a panel review of this. I'm sorry that we're kind of skipping over lots of points where we were going to try to get question and answer, but I'm just afraid that would get out of control. We wouldn't get the folks to do somewhat of a review. And the question that we present then to the review panel is simply, we presented a tool. Is this tool of value, and why would it be or why wouldn't it be? So in that we see our responsibility coming from the land grant to provide tools, ways of understanding your system better, And this is sort of a system-wide assessment, whether it be at the field scale really, or at the scale of the whole food system. So that's what we want feedback on from the review team. Certainly Liz, for example, has written papers about this, is an expert in this arena. Fabian has spent a lot of time thinking about this. And Katie is, where are you, Katie? Oh, there you are. Thinks about resilience on different scales, really large scales, and on different kinds of agricultural systems and communities. And then, of course, Ricardo, who I felt like took me out of the knees. And I'm still trying to recover, but I really will be curious to hear your input on this. Did I leave anybody out the panel? Okay.
Hello. How's everybody doing? What an incredibly impressive effort. And I thought I was in the conversation about Bob's farm, and I thought we had a really rich discussion. And so I have, I guess, two initial reflections. And one of them is that I think the value of this probably is mostly in the process rather than in some kind of an assessment product that you would produce. And I think what I heard around the room is a lot of interesting conversations that came up that were pretty qualitative in nature, that didn't easily reduce to a quantitative value that you would put at the end of any of these things. And I think that's not a failure, that's actually a strength of the process, that it is, it can hold the complexity that is inherent in the topic that we're talking about here. And I'm thinking about it as valuable, maybe somewhat in the way that holistic management has been valuable for a lot of producers, that you have a structured process that brings up, through a sort of structured set of categories, a number of issues to reflect on about your own operation, and then thinking about where your strengths are and where you might have room for growth. And I think what I like so much about that is that what we came upon is that the way each of these categories might matter in the context of any given whole farm system is a little different. So the point brought up about maybe pollinators aren't as important on a wheat farm, but maybe other kinds of beneficial organisms are. And I was thinking, well, if you leave the variable as number of pollinators, that's something that an ecologist can measure and easily quantify. If it's beneficial organisms, that's the kind of variable that a quantitative ecologist would just say, oh my gosh, like that's unmanageable. But I think it is the right variable for something that's conceived of as a process that you might, in pilot testing with different producers, refine over time so it's useful as a sort of heuristic tool. Ricardo brought that word in yesterday. Categories that help people think through where are my strengths and weaknesses and where can I grow in resilience. And then the other thing that I'm reflecting on from our conversation and some that I overheard around the room is that resilience is a value neutral term. It's not a normative term in the sense that it doesn't express in the way that Ricardo so beautifully expressed this morning, the sense of the purpose, what do we want out of our food system. It essentially means that whatever we have is likely to persist, right, in kind of its most fundamental definition. So something to kind of keep in the back of our minds about this and decide whether we would want incorporated in such a process is whether it's about trying to make more resilient the kinds of food systems we want, which is a different question than how resilient is this system as the system that it is. So in some cases, like when we were talking about the government programs and we were just having this conversation about, well, there's different kinds of government programs, some of which support fundamental on-farm resilience and some of which are making more resilient systems that have inherent problems in terms of transitioning to a more agroecological or socially just system, right? So these heavily subsidized crop insurance for certain kinds of, highly input dependent monocrops are not leading to people being incentivized to invest in soil organic matter or diversified farming systems. So they are making a certain kind of system more resilient, but that has nothing to do with the conversation we're all having here about agroecological transition. So that's something I wrestled with when I wrote that paper.
Yes.
Is when I talk about resilience, am I talking about a normative concept, something I like and that I want to move towards, or am I talking about just keeping stable what is?
Yeah. So important to define the two what There's only 2 wet,
Yes.
4 wet.
Yes.
So that's right up. Great. Fabian,
It's hard to summarize.
I'd love to put people on the spot.
Couple of reflections that I can think right now is first, the value of this exercise, I think, resides in the process, like you said, and as well and in the conversations that you will have, for example, with your neighbors, when you start comparing my operation versus your operations, and okay, then there's this adjustment that I may be needing to do because we can formally set up a group of neighbors which have a similar set of operations or totally different set of operations, but within the same of geographic constraints, and you will start comparing them not just as a snapshot in time, but also across time. I really like when it was this exercise of doing the 2010 versus 2016, I think it was in Town Harvest. That will be very powerful to say like, well, I'm really moving into this direction, or we are not moving, we are moving away from that direction. I think it's very important that we may be measuring the wrong variables, and and that's what I keep pointing out is like, yeah, don't get me wrong, don't kill me when I'm going to say, we all like pollinators, but I was the one who brought the example, why does a wheat farmer needs a pollinator? They may need parasitoids. So we may be talking about, that's why I said like beneficial organisms in terms of, or if you have many weeds, which also perform an ecosystem ecological service, such as providing pollen and nectar for your pollinators or parasitoids, they may not be a negative aspect. So how do we quantify the ecosystem services by those negative organisms, weeds? They may be enhancing your microbial communities. Right. So it is just by coming straightforward and say, I want weeds to go to 0, but at the same time, I want to have parasitoids or pollinators go to 100, that may be a contradiction in itself. So we may need to figure out what's the ecological role of all these different species. And another reflection that I have is that there's the both economic and social dimensions which are not fully represented here, at least in the ones I was associated with. So how do those, I think that in a couple of points we're talking about your relationship with your neighbors and your community, etc. But I would like to see those 2 dimensions in each one of those levels that we need the exercise.
Great, thanks. Katie?
Thank you so much. So great to be here. I want to jump off from some things I heard Liz say, which I think are really important, and just this idea that there's always this tension between sort of bottom-up indicators and top-down indicators, and Bruce and I have talked about this. So indicators that are comparable across a broad range in geographies, and/or indicators that are created in a specific place and have to do with a specific set of people and cultural practices and histories, and how do we reconcile what to use and how to make them. And I think that's a tough question, but one answer that falls from that is that, of course, the reflexive process itself is really important, and just having those discussions in and itself is not necessarily means to an end, but is a part of the journey. And as I was learning from Hannah and our group about some of the ways to think about the farm scale, I was struck, like I think all of us here were, by just that power of reflection, and that even though there's a specific set of indicators that we're proposing or that have been proposed today, there seems to be a lot of different opportunity to really pull at that quote that was from Liz's paper around social and ecological change, and thinking about these assessments as powerful in part through time, so as part of a single conversation or set of conversations, but that their power really grows in our ability to think about them as helping us understand and make sense of social ecological change and the way that these components of our lives that are so often kept separate are of course really coupled, and invested in each other and involved in complex feedbacks and relationships that are really tough to tease out unless you have a group of really brilliant people who know the system and have some thoughts about what can change about it and what needs to be transformed. So some of those more specifically that I was thinking of is this idea about scale. So there's been this really nice set of frameworks provided that have divided things out from the farm scale and the field scale. And in our conversation, it was made clear that the family farm also operates in multiple scales. You know, they have their family dynamics, and that's really important. Someone brought up the importance of succession planning. So thinking about that as an important scale, but of course that family farm is operating in a broader community. They're operating in a regional system with governance, decision makers that are going to impact how that farm is able to sustain itself in the world. They're operating in a world market system increasingly here in Montana. And so thinking about each of these scales as also multidimensional in their scalar orientation seems like a really neat opportunity for an assessment like this. I have a colleague who is invested in thinking about lock-in and how a resilience framework helps us think about when we make decisions about a certain place or a certain set of processes, we might put ourselves on a path, and that path may be more or less rigid. And so this assessment tool seems like there's opportunity to think through, where do we hit stuck spots? Where are we making really consequential decisions for a food system, for a family, for a region, for a culture, and what are the potential ways that we might run up against more challenges in terms of adaptation, especially as other slow variables, as we know, are happening and changing around us. This assessment, I think, might be really helpful in helping to think through some of those potential lock-ins. And maybe lastly, I'll just conclude with one other thing that Bruce and I have talked about, and other folks here I've talked with a lot, that anytime you're collecting data, it seems really important to also add into the conversation and the enthusiasm around creating a new data set. Who gets to collect that data? Who gets to maintain that data? Who is this data empowering? Who is it potentially marginalizing? And that this group seems like a really a type of community that's really ready to think about those questions and is tackling those head on. And so I really, I so appreciate that about this conversation, and I'm excited to see that as a part of future assessment conversations as well.
Thank you. Anything to say, Ricardo?
Yeah, I'll just go directly to the question that you asked, which was the value of the tool. And I think this needs to be pursued 1,000 times, yes. And the reason for that is that the overwhelming sense for me as I see this and hear it is that I'm outdated and obsoleted in a very good way, because I'm a product of a very orthodox agronomic education. Mexico State, Iowa State.
Could you speak up, please?
I actually can't. I've got a hoarse throat, but I'll try.
I can stand
Yeah.
That essentially taught that you only worried about one thing, and that was you. And to see that this is actually making visible what a lot of us advocate for, which is that we need to be thinking of simultaneous goals, answers a very common management principle, which has two versions. One is you manage the goals, and the other one, you can't manage what you can't see. And so this is directly addressing that. And the only other comments that I would have, I think have already been articulated, but to the extent that I understand the tool, some of these variables or data points fall into the category, it seems to me, of things that you can do something about as a manager. And some of them are things that you can't do something about. And so it would be useful to really focus on the things that you can do something about, and also to put them on a scale that has a guardrail that says this is actually the limit of what I can do something about, so you can also gauge the progress toward that. And then the gear that Fabian mentioned, I think, would really help with this, because as we're operating the systems, there will be interactions among all these different variables. And to be aware of them and actually crafting this would be helpful. The larger case that you mentioned, Fabian, is that there will be this inverse relationship generally between, or a relationship that, depending on what we're talking about, in some cases maybe inverse, in some cases maybe indirect, between biodiversity and the insect and microfaunal population, so both soil and aerial environments. And to know that when you're making a decision for the good in one variable, there's a constraint about what might happen in the other, as Fabian described, I think would increase the utility of it. If the moment you poked in one point, you immediately could see what's that going to happen here, rather than go into action and after 2 feet of management, observe that, have it come back at you. So that idea of having a guardrail or some way that there's a bumper on each of those variables might actually be something to play with. Again, to the extent that I understand this. But a question that I have, these days that we're so both obsessed and adept at automating things and digitizing and making things visual, we're all acquainted with digital yield monitors and combines and instruments of that sort. And at least in my fantasies, both Dave and Bob maybe can correct me on this, I've always imagined really competent farmers having a version of this in their head all the time. It's just that it's not on a poster. And maybe it's not even conscious most of the time. But, and I believe that because I once had an Iowa farmer tell me when I was advocating something about integrated pest management, and it had to do with butterfly habitat, said something very much like, I hear what you're saying, I understand that, but the 80 things I'm worrying about today, that's like down there. So having something that's constantly on your dashboard like this, I think would be really useful. But the question I have is, this is data collection, which means this is work, which means it adds to what you need to be doing and managing if you're actually the person making the decision. So the question I have is, how are you folks thinking about that? Is there a system, an apparatus, some kind of a support in order to help folks generate this so that they can do the management on the data that is collected that way? Because otherwise, it seems like an impossible thing to add. And on top of everything else that you're doing, collect all of this and then make decisions on that. And I'm sure there's an answer to that, and I'm just late to the game now. But absolutely do this. This answers that obsession with just, if you produce more yield, everything's going to take care of it. Yeah. And I love that this is the anti-version of that you're actually monitoring all the things that you care about, or at least in the salient ones.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. What we will do is leave our posters up, first of all. So for the rest of the meeting, come back, put a sticky, we'll get some sticky notes out here, or write right on them. It doesn't matter to us. Give us your feedback that way. I will conclude by one thing is in kind of answer to your question about, part of this is just trying to identify, is there any agreement in the kinds of things that we might put on these? And I think we got a lot of great feedback that way. But also the dream of, wouldn't it be cool if we had one of these polygons as a label on all your food? So in other words, that it's basically labels how well you're doing. And that we could see as a consumer what this farm's product is coming from, and maybe how that is changing over time. So that would be ultimately sort of the concept of capturing that. Lots of problems with that, clearly. But nonetheless, that's kind of this ephemeral dream we would like to maybe work towards, something like that. So again, corner any one of the people that facilitated here. Thank you so much for helping out students. You did a great job. And you corner them and ask your questions. I think it's going to have to be independent so we can get you to lunch and get you to the next session. Thank you again. Sorry that we got cut off.